You are told that speed has a pedigree. You are sold the idea that performance is something born in a Tuscan villa, hand-stitched by artisans in Modena, or forged in the Black Forest by men with family crests on their stationery. The automotive industry is built on a very specific, very expensive lie, that to go fast, you must pay a ransom to history. They want you to believe that soul comes from heritage, and that prestige is the only metric that matters when the rubber meets the road. But you know better, or at least, you suspect the truth. Step out onto the pavement. It's 2 a.m. The rain in Tokyo doesn't wash the city clean. It just makes the grime slicker. It turns the asphalt into a black mirror, reflecting the neon hemorrhage of a city that never really sleeps, only waits. Listen. Beneath the hum of the vending machines and the distant wail of a siren, there is something else. A low frequency, a mechanical threat. Most cars are built to be seen. They are vanity projects, mobile sculptures designed to park in front of casinos and demand attention. They are loud because they are insecure. But there is a machine that moves through these streets like a phantom. It is boxy. It is unassuming. To the untrained eye, it is a sedan for a but to you, standing there in the cold damp of the midnight air, you know it is a ghost story. That the Nissan Skyline is not merely a machine. It is the manifestation of a grudge. To understand this car, you have to strip away the glossy magazine covers and the video game polygons. You have to look at the metal, cold, industrial, unsympathetic. The European marks treat their cars like mistresses, demanding, temperamental, beautiful. The Skyline is a weapon, and weapons do not need to be beautiful. They only need to work. The hierarchy of the automotive world is simple. Price equals performance. If you pay 6 figures, you get to rule the left lane. It's a gentleman's agreement, a polite society of speed. The Skyline looked at that agreement, lit a cigarette, and burned the contract to ash. It broke the unspoken rule. It used superior engineering to embarrass heritage brands, proving that prestige is a marketing lie, and pure mathematics is the only truth on the asphalt. When you look at a Porsche 911 from the late 80s, you see a curve. When you look at a Skyline, you see a calculation. It is a brick thrown through the window of the establishment. It doesn't care about your leather stitching. It doesn't care about your badge. It cares about grip, thermal efficiency, and the brutal application of physics. Where did this ghost come from? It didn't start on a racetrack. It started in the ashes. Go back. Before the neon, before the drift smoke, go back to a defeated nation. Post-war Japan was a landscape of smokestacks and silence. The aviation engineers who had designed the Zero fighter, men who had mastered the art of making metal dance in the air war, suddenly grounded. Their wings were clipped by treaties and surrender documents. But you cannot kill the engineer's mind. You cannot turn off the obsession with aerodynamics and power just because the war is over. So, they went underground. Not literally, but spiritually. These men, who once built nightmares for the Allied forces, were absorbed into the automotive industry. Specifically, the Prince Motor Company. They took the principles of aviation lightness, power density, the absolute refusal to compromise, and they poured it into 4 wheels. The Skyline is haunted by these men. It is the ghost of the Zero fighter, reincarnated to fight a new war. A war not for territory, but for respect. When you hear that twin-turbo straight-six engine spool up, you aren't hearing a car. You are hearing the suppressed scream of a generation of engineers who were told they were finished. They built a machine to prove they were just getting started. This is why the Skyline feels different. It lacks the arrogance of the Italian supercars. It possesses a cold, clinical rage. You sit inside, and the interior is sparse, plastic, utilitarian. It feels like a cockpit, yes, but not a luxury one. It feels like the control room of a power plant. The gauges glow a dull, amber red, or a clinical green. They don't tell you how rich you are. They tell you the oil pressure, the boost level, the water temperature. They demand your attention because the machine is alive, and it is hungry. The Europeans sell you a lifestyle. The Skyline sells you a result. Consider the nickname, Godzilla. The West uses it as a term of endearment now, a pop culture sticker to slap on a bumper. But think about what it really means. Godzilla wasn't a hero. It was a force of nature. It was a monster created by the hubris of the nuclear age that rose from the sea to level Tokyo. The Skyline is the same. It is a monster created by the hubris of the combustion age, rising from the factory floor to level the playing field. It wasn't built to show off. It was built to win. And not just to win, but to dominate so thoroughly that the competition would question their own existence. It is the silent killer in the rearview mirror, the pair of circular taillights fading into the fog before you even realize you've been past dot. So, as you stand there in the rain, watching the steam rise off the hood of this dormant beast, realize what you are looking at. You are not looking at a car that was designed by a focus group. You are looking at a ghost, a phantom born of defeat, fueled by resentment, and perfected by math. It waits for the light to turn green, not to race you, but to dismantle you. The world loves a hierarchy, the rich on top, the poor on the bottom, the expensive cars in the front, the cheap ones in the back. The Skyline is the disruptor. It is the glitch in the matrix. It is the moment the calculator realizes it is smarter than the operator. The engine is cold now. The city is quiet, but the ghost is always there, lurking in the machinery, waiting for the moment to remind the world that prestige is just a word. Speed is the only law, and tonight, the law is on our side. You look at a modern supercar, and you see vanity. You see carbon fiber we've meant to be in, active aerodynamics meant to impress valets who will never take the car past second gear, and a price tag that serves as a barrier to entry for the working class. It is a club, a velvet rope, a lie wrapped in leather. But before the marketing departments took over the asylum, there was a brief, violent moment in history where speed was born from desperation. To understand the Skyline, you have to forget Nissan. Nissan is just the corporate umbrella, the suit that bought the rights to the story. The soul of this machine was forged in the silence of 1945, when the sky was suddenly closed for business. Imagine the psychological state of a man who spent a decade designing the Mitsubishi Zero or the Nakajima Hayabusa. You are an engineer of the highest order. You deal in lift coefficients, thrust-to-weight ratios, and the absolute, freezing certainty of altitude. Then, the war ends. The factories are bombed out shells. The occupation forces strip the machinery. You are forbidden from building anything that flies. What happens to that energy? It doesn't dissipate. It sinks into the ground, heavy and resentful. It looks for a new outlet. This is the origin of the Prince Motor Company. It wasn't a car manufacturer. It was a refugee camp for grounded aviators, engineers from the Takikawa Aircraft Company. Men who dreamed in 3 dimensions were suddenly forced to think in 2. They looked at the primitive automobiles chugging through the debris of Tokyo heavy, crude, unrefined things, and they felt a profound professional insult. You see, the automotive industry of the 1950s was built on the concept of good enough. Cast iron blocks, leaf springs that dated back to horse carriages, and tolerances you could measure with a ruler. But for the men at Prince, good enough got you killed at 20,000 feet. They brought an aviation neurosis to the assembly line. They didn't weld steel. They managed stress. They didn't tune engines. They balanced internal harmonics. They named the company Prince to honor the Japanese royal family. A cynical bit of branding to lend prestige to a product built in the mud. But underneath the badges and the chrome trim, there was no royalty. There was only cold, hard mathematics. You have to understand the chassis of the early Prince Skylines to understand why the Europeans should have been terrified. While the British were nailing wood to frames and the Americans were obsessing over tail, Prince engineers were trying to figure out how to make a car handle like a fighter plane taxiing on a runway. They utilized a D-on tube rear suspensioner setup that was complex, expensive, and utterly unnecessary for a family sedan. But they didn't care about cost. They cared about keeping the tire contact patch parallel to the road surface, regardless of the chassis roll. It was an obsession with grip that predated the existence of tires good enough to utilize it. They built the chassis with a unibody construction, when most of the world was still bolting bodies onto ladder frames. This wasn't for safety. It was for rigidity. They wanted the car to be a single, tensioned muscle, not a collection of parts rattling in formation. When you drive an early Prince, you don't feel luxury. You feel the ghost of an airframe. You feel the vibration of an engine that wants to pull the nose up, but is shackled to the asphalt by gravity and treaties. And then there was the engine, the GI series. You look at it now and it seems archaic, a lump of iron, but trace the lineage. These engines were designed by men who were used to squeezing thousands of horsepower out of radial engines to outrun P-51 Mustangs. They understood thermal efficiency in a way that car designers didn't. They realized early on that power was nothing without the ability to breathe. They focused on head flow, on valve timing, on the surgical precision of the combustion cycle, while the Italians were building engines with passion and soul. Code words for erratic tolerances and oil leak. Prince was building engines with slide rules. This created a strange duality. The Prince Skyline looked like a polite, boxy sedan. It looked like something a salaryman would drive to a mid-level management job. But underneath, it was a weapon. It was a sleeper agent. It was the first time the Japanese automotive industry decided that it wasn't enough to just participate. They wanted to dominate through engineering superiority. This philosophy culminated in the Prince R380, a racing prototype that would eventually bleed its DNA into the Skyline GTR. But even before the race cars, the street cars held a secret. They were over-engineered to a fault. The switches clicked with the authority of a cockpit toggle. The steering had a weight to it that felt mechanical, direct, unassisted by the lies of hydraulics. You drive a modern car, and the computer interprets your inputs. It decides if you're allowed to slide. It decides if you're allowed to accelerate. In a Prince, you are the pilot. If you crash, it's because you failed the machine, not the other way around. The tragedy of Prince Motors is the tragedy of all pure engineers. They were terrible at business. They spent too much money on research, too much time on perfection, and not enough on marketing. They were bleeding cash, pouring their resources into making the perfect suspension for a car that was priced to compete with tractors. By the mid-1960s, the wolves were circling. The Japanese government was pushing for consolidation. Nissan, the giant, the volume seller, the company that understood the bottom line better than the apex of a corner, was waiting in the wings. You might think this is where the spirit died. You might think the acquisition by Nissan was the end of the aviation dream. But you'd be wrong. Viruses don't die when they infect a host. They rewrite the host's DNA. Prince didn't disappear into Nissan. Prince hijacked it. The engineers from Takekawa didn't leave. They just changed uniforms. They took their blueprints, their obsession with weight reduction, and their hatred of inefficiency, and they walked into the Nissan headquarters. They brought the ghost of the fighter plane with them, and they were about to unleash a monster that would make the European aristocracy choke on their heritage. The Prince name would fade, but the blood and oil remained. The Skyline wasn't a Nissan invention. It was a Trojan horse, built by pilots, rolled into the automotive world to prove that prestige is a marketing lie, and pure mathematics is the only truth on the asphalt. You think beauty is aerodynamic. You have been conditioned by decades of Italian marketing to believe that speed requires curves, that a fast car must look like a woman lying on her side or a teardrop falling through the atmosphere. You've been lied to. Speed doesn't care about your aesthetics. Speed is a mathematical equation, and sometimes the solution to that equation looks like a brick. We are in the late 1960s now. The marriage, or perhaps the hostile takeover between Prince and Nissan, is finalized. The aviation engineers who built Zeros and bombers have been absorbed into the corporate machine. But they didn't leave their slide rules at the door. They are angry, they are hungry, and they are about to build something that rejects the very concept of elegance in favor of something far more terrifying. Absolute, rigid efficiency. Enter the C10, the third generation. The world looks at it and sees a sedan for us. It has 4 doors. It has a trunk for groceries. It has the drag coefficient of a small apartment building. But you aren't looking closely enough. You are looking at the skin, not the bone structure. They called it the Hakasuka, the box Skyline. It's a name that sounds cute until you see it in your rearview mirror, closing the gap with the predatory indifference of a shark in a swimming pool. You have to understand the arrogance of this design. In Europe, Enzo Ferrari is selling sex. In Stuttgart, Porsche is refining the Beetle. And in Japan, Nissan decides that the ultimate expression of performance is a 3-box design that looks like it was carved out of granite with a chainsaw. This is the cynicism of the engineer on full display. They knew that a stiff chassis was worth more than a pretty fender. They didn't care if you didn't want to hang a poster of it on your bedroom wall. They didn't build it for your wall. They built it to destroy the competition on the Fuji Speedway. The Hakasuka is the automotive equivalent of a fist. It's not subtle. It doesn't negotiate. It simply occupies the space where other cars used to be. But a box is just a coffin without a heart. And this is where the ghost story truly begins. They took the GR8 engine from the Prince R380 race car, a pure-blooded prototype racer designed to kill Porsches, and they detuned it, just barely. They stripped away the civility, ignored the noise regulations, and dropped this race-bred scream into the engine bay of a square sedan. They called it the S20. You turn the key, and it doesn't purr. It rattles. It coughs. It sounds like a bag of bolts being shaken by an angry god. This is the sound of dual overhead cams and 4 valves per cylinder in an era when most family cars were struggling to breathe through a straw. It produces 160 horsepower. That number sounds quaint to you now, doesn't it? You, with your traction control and your turbo lag. But in 1969, 160 horsepower in a chassis this rigid was a revelation. It was a weapon. It revved to 7,500 RPM, a scream that shattered the polite silence of the Japanese automotive industry. It wasn't about top speed in a straight line. Any American muscle car could do that. It was about the corners. The Hakasuka didn't lean. It didn't wallow. It planted its tires into the asphalt and pivoted around physics like it had rewritten the laws of motion. And then they gave it the badge, GTR, Gran Turismo Racer, 3 letters, red and chrome. That badge wasn't a trim level. It wasn't a marketing package that gave you leather seats and a spoiler. It was a warning label. It signified that the vehicle you were looking at was only legally a road car because of a loophole in the paperwork. The interior was Spartan. The steering was heavy. The clutch was a leg press machine. It demanded everything from you. If you were a bad driver, the Hakasuka would not save you. It would simply watch you crash with cold, mechanical indifference. But if you were good, if you respected the math, then you became part of the legend. The car went to the track. And this is where the romance dies and the slaughter begins. The Hakasuka didn't just win. It embarrassed. It took the heritage brands, the expensive imports, the pedigreed machines, and it fed them their own teeth. 50 victories. Read that again. 50. From May 1969 to October 1971, the GTR went on a streak that defies logic. It won 49 consecutive races. The 50th win cemented the legend. It became the Boxy Samurai, a nickname that implies honor. But there was no honor in what it did to the Mazda rotary coupes. It was a massacre. The Hakasuka proved the central thesis of the Skyline philosophy. Prestige is a lie. A badge from Italy or Germany adds zeros to the price tag, but it doesn't add grip to the tires. The Skyline was ugly, loud, and uncomfortable. It was a tool, a hammer in a world of porcelain vases. When you look at a Hakasuka today, parked in a climate-controlled garage, owned by a collector who is afraid to drive it in the rain, you are looking at a caged animal. It wasn't meant to be polished. It was meant to be bruised. It was meant to smell like unburned fuel and burning rubber. It was the first time the world realized that a family sedan could be a supercar killer, provided you stripped out the soul and replaced it with pure, cold engineering. The boxy shape would eventually fade, replaced by the curves of the 70s, but the damage was done. The ghost was in the machine now. The GTR badge had been forged in fire. They had taken a box, filled it with aviation technology, and used it to bludgeon the automotive hierarchy into submission. You can respect the beauty of a Ferrari, but you fear the competence of the Skyline. And you should, because the box is watching, and it knows that your prestige is just a marketing lie. You think progress is a straight line. You have been trained to believe that every model year brings more horsepower, tighter suspension, and faster lap times. You believe in the upward trajectory of the machine, but history is not a slope. It is a series of jagged cliffs, and sometimes the road just disappears beneath the wheels. After the Hakasuka, after the glory of 50 victories, the Skyline didn't just stumble, it was strangled. It starts in 1972, the C110 chassis. They called it the Kenbury, named after a marketing campaign featuring a fictional Western couple, Ken and Mary. It was a beautiful lie. You look at the car now, with its fastback roofline echoing the American muscle cars of the era, Dodge Charger reflected in a funhouse mirror, and you see ambition. It was wider, heavier, more substantial. It was supposed to be the coronation of the Skyline as a global icon. But you know what they say about timing. It isn't everything, it's the only thing. And the C110 arrived at the funeral of the high-octane era. The world didn't want speed anymore. The world wanted survival. The 1973 oil crisis didn't just raise gas prices. It broke the psychological spine of the automotive industry. Overnight, performance became a sign. Excess became vulgar. The screaming 2.0-liter inline-six that had terrorized the circuits of Japan was suddenly viewed as a liability. You can almost feel the air leave the room. The engineers, those former aviation ghosts who built Zero fighters and race cars, were told to put down their slide rules and pick up emissions charts. The GR version of the Ken Marie, the KPGC 110, is the tragic hero of this chapter. It is the rarest of the breed, a ghost before it even died. They built 197 of them, just 190-7.Y, because nobody bought them. You couldn't race them. Nissan pulled out of competition before the car turned a single wheel in anger. The strict emissions regulations were a noose around the S20 engine's neck. They unsoldered the badges, covered the cars in dust sheets, and walked away. The bloodline didn't fade. It was severed. Then came the silence. For 16 years, the letters GTR would not be spoken. They were buried in the archives, a forbidden spell that no one dared to cast. Instead, you got the Japan series, the C210. Look at it. It is a box of compromises. The sharp, predatory lines of the Hakasuka were smoothed out into something domestic, something safe. The Skyline stopped being a weapon and started being a living room. They gave you velour seats. They gave you chrome trim. They gave you a ride quality that wouldn't spill your coffee, that wouldn't spill your Grand Tourer, because they couldn't sell you a race car. It is the ultimate cynical pivot. When you can't win on the asphalt, you win in the brochure. They marketed a lifestyle of leisure to a populace that was too tired to drive fast. The engineering prowess that had humiliated Porsche was retasked to dampen road noise. It was a lobotomy performed with a socket wrench. You watch the evolution through the 1980s, and it feels like watching a predator in a zoo. The R30 generation arrived, the Iron Mask. It was sharper, yes. It had the FJ20ET engine turbocharged, finally bringing some violence back to the equation. But it lacked the soul. It was an era of celebrity endorsements. They hired Paul Newman to sell the R30. Think about the desperation of that. You don't need a Hollywood actor to sell a car that breaks physics. You only need a Hollywood actor to sell a car that is trying to convince you it still matters. The Newman Skyline was a good car, but good is the enemy of the legend. It was a mass-produced commodity, a box of steel and plastic designed to meet sales quotas, not to haunt the dreams of Italian designers. The hierarchy of price equals performance was re-established. The Skyline knew its place again. It was a mid-level executive's commuter car, occasionally dressed up in track shoes to pretend it remembered how to run. This is the melancholy middle act. The lost decades. To the casual observer, the brand was successful, sales were fine, the cars were reliable. But you know the truth. You know that under the hood, the spirit was dormant. The engineers were biding their time, hiding their ambition in the bottom drawers of their desks, waiting for the oil crisis to be a memory, waiting for the economy to bubble, waiting for the leash to snap. They were building family sedans, but in the back of their minds, they were doing the math. They were calculating the friction coefficients of all-wheel drive. They were dreaming of twin turbos. The Skyline wasn't dead. It was just sleeping, a comatose king in a concrete sarcophagus, waiting for the late 80s to inject it with adrenaline and monsters. The silence was deafening, but if you put your ear to the asphalt, you could hear the heartbeat. You think you understand the hierarchy of the road. You have been conditioned to believe that a badge stamped in Stuttgart or Maranello carries a mystical weight, a divine right to the fast lane. You believe that money buys speed, and that soul is something born in an Italian foundry. But you are wrong. In the late 1980s, while the rest of the world was drowning in excess and neon-soaked vanity, a group of engineers in Japan was sitting in a smoke-filled room, looking at the automotive hierarchy and seeing only an error in the equation. They didn't want to join the club. They wanted to burn the clubhouse down. This wasn't about passion. Passion is messy. Passion makes mistakes. This was about Project 901. The name sounds like a tax form, doesn't it? It's bureaucratic, cold, but the intent was anything but administrative. The mandate was simple. By the 1990s, Nissan would have the #1 handling car in the world. Not good, not competitive. #1. To achieve that, they had to stop building cars and start building weapons. The target was the Porsche 944. Later, the 959. The Europeans were resting on decades of heritage, convinced that their pedigree was a shield. Nissan realized that heritage is just a ghost story you tell yourself to justify a lack of innovation. To beat the Europeans, Nissan couldn't just add more horsepower. Any idiot can bolt a turbo to a block and go fast in a straight line. American muscle cars had been doing that for 20 years, and they couldn't turn a corner without filing for bankruptcy. No, the problem wasn't power. The problem was friction. You see, the laws of physics are cruel. If you send 500 horsepower to the rear wheels, you get smoke and a loss of control. If you send it to all four wheels, like Audi did with the Quattro, you get grip, sure, but you also get You get a heavy, numb sledgehammer that plows off the road when you push it too hard. A sledgehammer is fine for a rally stage, but it is useless for surgery. And Project 901 required a scalpel. Enter the Attesati. It sounds like a computer operating system, and in a way, it was. This was the moment the car gained a brain. Before this, you drove the machine. With the Tessa, the machine corrected you. It was an all-wheel drive system that pretended to be rear-wheel drive. It sat there, dormant, letting the rear tires do the work, letting the car rotate, letting you feel like a hero. But the moment the millisecond the rear tires lost the argument with the asphalt, the system woke up. It sent torque to the front wheels instantly. Not 50/50ths, not a fixed ratio. Exactly what was needed to pull the car out of the slide, and not a percentage point more. It was pure mathematics applied to violence. It allowed a driver to exit a corner with the throttle pinned to the floor, defying the natural instinct of self-preservation, while the Ferrari driver was feathering the gas, praying to his Italian saints not to spin out. The Skyline driver was simply doing math, and the math said, go faster. But a brain needs a heart, or in this case, a nuclear reactor. They called it the RB26DIT, 2.6 liters, twin turbos, inline 6, cast iron block. If you look at the specs on paper, it seems reasonable, but you have to understand the lie. Japan had a gentleman's agreement at the time, a handshake deal among manufacturers to cap horsepower at 276. It was a societal attempt to stop the arms race. Nissan signed the paper, smiled, and then built an engine capable of handling 600 horsepower without changing a single internal component. The 276 number was a marketing fiction, a restrictor pill in a boost line, a polite cough to cover a scream. The RB26 was designed for Group A racing first, and the streets second. It was over-engineered to a degree that bordered on financial irresponsibility. It was heavy, it was durable, and it was capable of taking so much boost that it embarrassed engines costing 5 times as much. This wasn't craftsmanship, it was industrial arrogance. They took this prototype, this GTR, to the green hell, the place where European egos go to die. They weren't there to set a lap time, they were there to verify the kill. The target was 8 minutes and 20 seconds. The R32 GTR, driven by Hiroyoshi Katayama, shattered it. It didn't just beat the Porsche, it made the Porsche look antiquated. It was the moment the analog world died, and the digital age took its first breath of tire smoke. But when you drive it, you don't feel the computer code. You feel the weight. It feels solid, heavy, like a tool forged from a single piece of iron. You turn the wheel, and the nose dives in. You stomp the gas, and instead of death, you get acceleration. It doesn't have the romance of a V12. It doesn't scream like a banshee. It rushes like a jet turbine. It is a cold, efficient, ruthless sound. It is the sound of superior engineering dismantling the concept of prestige. Project 901 was a success, but it was also a curse. By creating a car that relied on pure mathematics rather than driver intuition, Nissan inadvertently started a war. They proved that you could cheat physics if your calculator was fast enough. The R32 GTR wasn't just a car. It was a ghost story for the competition. It was the realization that the old guard, with their leather driving gloves and their heritage, were obsolete. The beast had awakened, and it didn't care about your badge. It only cared about the numbers. And the numbers never lie. Scene end. You think you understand dominance. You imagine a close race, a rival edged out by a bumper, a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. That is the romantic lie sold to you by cinema. Real dominance is boring. Real dominance is a foregone conclusion. Real dominance is a massacre committed in silence before the starting pistol even fires. By the late 1980s, the automotive hierarchy was comfortable. It was safe. The Europeans held the high ground of prestige, the Americans held the low ground of displacement, and the Japanese were expected to stay in the middle, building reliable appliances for people who didn't dream. But something had shifted in the air over Europe. The engineers, Those ghosts of the Zero fighters we talked about had stopped trying to compete. They decided to transcend. Enter the BNR-32, the GTR, a machine that didn't just read the rulebook. It fed the rulebook into a shredder and burned the confetti. You have to understand the arrogance required to build this car. Nissan looked at the Porsche 959, the technological peak of the decade, and decided they could replicate that performance for the price of a mid-level sedan. They didn't do it with passion, they did it with math. The RB26D ETT engine wasn't a heart, it was a reactor. The Atessa ETS all-wheel drive system wasn't a drivetrain, it was a supercomputer that humiliated physics. When the R32 arrived in Group A racing, it didn't just win, it ended the conversation. Look at the Australian touring car scene in 1990. The Ford Sierra RS500 Cosworth was the king. It was a sledgehammer. Then the Skyline arrived. It was a scalpel wielded by a surgeon who didn't care if the patient lived or died. The Australian press, terrified and awed in equal measure, christened it Godzilla. They meant it as a monster from the east, come to destroy their local ecosystem. They were right. The R32 won 29 races out of 29 starts in the Japanese Touring Car Championship. It didn't lose. It couldn't lose. It was an error in the matrix of motorsport, a glitch that allowed a relatively heavy coupe to corner as if it were on rails, leaving the European aristocracy choking on unburnt hydrocarbons and their own bruised egos. This is where the cynicism of the industry reveals itself. When a European car dominates, it is hailed as heritage and pedigree. When a Japanese car dominates, it is called unfair. The R32 was so surgically precise, so violently effective, that the governing bodies didn't try to beat it on the track. They beat it in the boardroom. They changed the rules. They banned turbocharging. They banned all-wheel drive. They legislated the Skyline out of existence because they couldn't engineer a way around it. It was the ultimate admission of defeat. The R32 died a martyr to its own perfection. But you can't kill a ghost. The legend didn't fade. It mutated. It moved from the asphalt to the cathode ray tube. The R33 followed. It was softer, heavier, perhaps a little too civilized, but it carried the bloodline. And then came the R34. If the R32 was the revolution, the R34 was the coronation. This is where the story shifts from the track to your memory. You probably didn't see an R34 on the street in 1999. You saw it in Gran Turismo. You drove it with a plastic controller, tuning gear ratios in a virtual garage, learning the gospel of the RB26. Sony did more for Nissan's legacy than any dealership ever could. They planted a virus in the minds of a generation. While Ferrari and Lamborghini were selling posters to put on bedroom walls, the Skyline was infiltrating the nervous system of the youth. You learned that horsepower numbers were lies, and that torque splits and traction circles were the truth. The R34, with its multifunction display screen showing you G-forces and boost pressure, wasn't just a car. It was a fighter jet cockpit for the road. It validated the video game generation. It told you that your obsession with data was correct. The R34 was the final mechanical breath. Before the world went fully digital, it was the peak of analog brutality married to electronic precision. It was angry. It was blocky. It looked like it was carved out of a solid block of spite. It stood on the highway, staring down supercars that cost 4 times as much. And it didn't blink. It proved that prestige is a marketing lie. A badge is just plastic. The only truth on the asphalt is engineering. The Skyline didn't need a heritage of wine-sipping aristocrats to make it fast. It just needed physics and the cold, hard ambition of a country rebuilding itself from the ashes. By the time the R34 production ended, the Skyline wasn't just a car anymore. It was a deity. It had eaten the world, digested the competition, and left behind a legacy that no amount of Italian leather or German precision could ever replicate. It taught you that the monster under the bed is real, and it's faster than you. You are standing at the edge of an era, watching the taillights fade into the mist. It doesn't end with a bang. It doesn't end with a grand fiery crash on the Suzuka circuit. It ends in a boardroom. It ends with a signature on a piece of paper that separates a soul from a body. For decades, the name Skyline and the badge GTR were synonymous. They were the katana and the samurai one, useless without the other. But progress, that relentless, hungry god of the automotive industry, demanded a sacrifice. To conquer the global market, Nissan decided that the Skyline had to grow up. It had to put on a suit. It had to become a comfortable, executive stand for men who play golf, not for men who hunt Porsches at midnight. And the GTR was surgically removed. It was stripped of its family name, isolated, and turned into a standalone weapon. The R35, a technological marvel, yes, a singularity of performance. But when you look at it, really look at it, you realize something is missing. The ghost is gone. You look at the R35 and you see the ultimate triumph of mathematics. It is a car built by algorithms to dismantle the ego of Italian heritage brands. It does exactly what the DNA of the Skyline always promised. It uses superior engineering to embarrass the aristocracy of speed. It is faster than a Ferrari. It grips harder than a Lamborghini. It costs a fraction of the price. It is the democratization of velocity. But sit inside. It feels solved. The steering is precise, but it is the precision of a surgeon robot, not a living hand. The transmission shifts faster than you can blink, but it denies you the satisfaction of the throw. The computer manages the traction, the yaw, the boost, and the braking. You are not the driver anymore. You are the executive decision maker. The car is doing the work. You are just signing off on the velocity. This is the cynicism of the modern era. We traded engagement for lap times. We traded the smell of unburnt fuel and the terror of turbo lag for launch control and infotainment systems. The R35 is a weapon, certainly, but it is a drone strike. The Hakasuka, the Kenmari, the R32, the R34, those were knife fights in a dark alley. And what of the nameplate that remained? The Skyline, it drifted into obscurity. In the West, you know it as the Infiniti G35, the Q50, competent cars, reliable, safe. They are the cars you buy when you get a promotion to middle management and want to look sensible. They have abandoned the inline-six for the V6. They have abandoned the raw, jagged edge of the Prince Motor Company legacy for the smooth, marketable curves of global luxury. The separation killed the magic. By isolating the performance, the GTR from the lineage, the Skyline, the narrative was severed. The Skyline was no longer the wolf in sheep's clothing. It was just a sheep. And the GTR was no longer the working-class hero rising from the sedan chassis to kill giants. It was born a giant. It lost the underdog story. It lost the context. You see, the beauty of the R32 or the R34 wasn't just that they were fast. It was that they looked like taxis until they opened their throats. They were subversive. They were industrial espionage on four wheels. They were a secret handshake among those who knew that prestige is a marketing lie and pure mathematics is the only truth on the asphalt. Why does the classic lineage feel more alive? Why do you ache for an R32 with a cracked dashboard and the smell of old oil, rather than the sterilized perfection of a modern suit? Because the old machines were flawed, and in their flaws, they found humanity. The turbo lag was a breath, a pause before the scream. The heavy steering was a conversation between your palms and the pavement. The chassis flex, the vibration, the heat radiating through the fire wallet was a biological feedback loop. The car needed you. It needed you to manage the revs, to catch the slide, to understand its temper. Modern supercars, including the current GTR, treat you like a liability. They tolerate your input, but they protect themselves from your incompetence with layers of silicon. They are perfect. And perfection is boring. Perfection is the silence of a solved equation. The Skyline lineage from the 1960s to the early 2000s was a struggle. It was post-war Japan trying to prove it could build wings without leaving the ground. It was a desperate, beautiful clawing for respect in a world that worshipped European crests. That struggle is what you feel when you grab the shift knob of an R34. You feel the ghost of the aviation engineers. You feel the ambition. Now, the silence has settled. The GTR is a global icon, appearing in movies and video games, a household name. It won, but in winning, it died. It became part of the establishment it was built to destroy. The Skyline nameplate still exists, slapped onto the back of sedans that will never see a racetrack, never haunt a mountain pass, never terrify a Porsche owner on the wagon. The name survives, but the bloodline has run dry. So, where does that leave you? Standing in the rain, looking back, you realize now that we are not mourning a car. We are mourning a time when machinery was honest. We are mourning the era of mechanical sympathy. The Skyline is not merely a machine. It is a ghost story, and like all good ghost stories, it is scarier, more visceral, and more real than the living things that replaced it. The rise was silent, the dominance was loud, but the end is just the quiet hum of a perfectly efficient engine, driving a perfectly balanced chassis down a perfectly paved road, with no one feeling a damn thing.